In lesson 6, we talked about harmony by fourths and fifths. Now we're going to talk about harmony by seconds and sevenths in lesson 7. We won't be talking about harmony by thirds and sixths because that's the familiar tertian harmony that everybody studies anyway in tonal harmony. So, seconds and sevenths. Well, if we talk about harmony by seconds and sevenths, there's a lot of different categories we can talk about. First of all, it could be diatonic or chromatic. Let's listen to example 1a. As you can hear in example 1a, this example is all made up of seconds and sevenths, but it's all taken from one diatonic scale. There are no alterations at all. It actually ends up being in Phrygian mode. So it gives a certain simplicity to it despite the dissonance in the chords. Notice also the big difference between the cluster chords, when it's by seconds, and the chords by sevenths. Even though the sevenths are the inversion of the seconds, there is a definite feeling of spaciousness when we change the arrangement like that. Seconds could also be chromatic. Let's listen to example 1b. As we can see in example 1b, okay, it's pretty much the same kind of idea. The outer voices make a counterpoint. The chords sometimes are fairly closely clustered, sometimes farther apart. Notice the last chord, for example, is the closest cluster of the whole little phrase, which is part of the way we make the cadence here, because you can't really make a reduction in harmonic tension very much when you're using seconds. So this kind of change of spacing from to at the end is just one way to do it. Okay, if we think about three-note chords in seconds, there are actually three kinds of three-note chords in seconds. Although we're used to thinking of seconds as in two varieties, major and minor, there's really quite a difference between them. A chord made up of only major seconds is definitely gentler than a chord including a minor second. So example 2a, like just C, D, E, there was just two major seconds, is definitely gentler than, let's say, 2b, and then the most extreme of all, the chromatic cluster C. As you can see, there's even a feeling that A feels quite transparent compared to C. In B, the reason there are two chords is just the spacing. In the first one, the major second is on the bottom and the minor second on top. In the second one, it's the opposite. But in terms of the general character of the chord, it's pretty much the same. Okay, so in A, those first three notes could actually be found in a diatonic scale, okay, whereas the last one, okay, C, okay, is totally chromatic. The ones in B can be found in various diatonic scales. So again, they're easier to integrate into a tonal context if that's what you want to do. Inversion, of course, gives chords by sevenths, and the thing to realize is that brings in thirds and sixths. If we just look at the beginning of example 3, there's an E followed by a chord F sharp and D. Well, it's true that D, E, F sharp is a cluster spread out, but it also includes F sharp and D, which is a sixth. In other words, as soon as we have three notes in a second or seventh chord, we're going to have a third or a sixth somewhere in the package. And that can be useful sometimes as a way to sort of make the texture generally rather gentler. By combining wider spacing of the seconds, let's say into ninths or sevenths, and by arranging things so we sometimes hear sixths and thirds, it makes the texture less sort of austere all the way through. Let's listen to example 3. If we look at example 3, there's some things to notice about it. First of all, I'm going to play the outer parts without the middle part. You'll notice that, just as in tonal harmony, there is a real counterpoint between the upper part and the bass. And that counterpoint, despite the fact that the harmony is not at all familiar from tonal harmony, that counterpoint gives a lot of direction and orientation to what you're listening. In other words, if the bass didn't make a good counterpoint, it wouldn't be any better here than it would be to have a lousy bass line in a tonal piece. So the independent bass line is important. The other thing to notice is that there's a balance here between chords involving no minor seconds, some minor seconds. For example, in the first bar, no minor second, then no minor second here. Here we finally do have a minor second, the C to the B. Also notice there's an E flat here. Now that E flat actually is not strictly speaking part of the second chord. We could have CBA or CBD, but we're not going to have CBE flat. So where does that E flat come from in bar 2? It comes from, it's just a passing chord. Okay, in the same way that in tonal harmony you can have non-harmonic tones, tones that don't interfere with the harmony or not part of the chord. You can have the same thing in second harmony, provided the majority of the chords make the kind of harmony clear. Then we go on to bar 3. In bar 3 we have E, F, G. So here we do have a semitone dissonance between E and the F. It's not a coincidence that the harshest dissonance to date in the piece comes under the G in measure 3, because that's the highest note we've had in the piece so far. In fact, it's sort of a little climax to the piece. So the harsher dissonance gives it a kind of accent. Gentler dissonances here, all gentler. A little bit harsher here, gentler. So you can see there's a definite sort of plan to the way the harsher dissonances are used compared to the others. And that's what enables this kind of harmony to breathe. The variety of spacing and the variety between the harsher semitone dissonances and the ones without semitones. So another aspect of using harmony in seconds, even with just these 3-note chords, is you want to avoid it sounding like a mistake. Obviously, if I take a simple tonal progression, that just sounds like a mistake. So what prevents it from sounding like a mistake? Answer: consistence overall and voice leading. Let's listen to example 4. In example 4, you can see that the accompaniment is just 2 clusters alternating, what you might call a neighbor note of clusters, accompanying a melody. The melody is spread out. And then notice at the end, change of register. I just put the last cluster down an octave. Okay, so first of all, the fact is that the 2 clusters were neighbor notes like that makes it very clear it's intentional. Okay, in other words, there's simple voice leading connecting those 2 clusters, so just back and forth. And then the voice leading break at the end, where I go down an octave, and the rhythmic stop, that's what makes the cadence here. Because again, we can't keep harmony in seconds and easily make a cadence without a change in harmonic tension. We did it a little bit in example 3 by spreading things out. It's actually C, D, E, F. Spread out, it's less tense than that. In this case, I didn't want to do that, so another way would be just change the texture with that change of octave. Okay, so once you get beyond 3 notes, if you want to keep 3-note harmony, but in 4 parts, what note do you double? Well, there are 3 possibilities. Let's look at example 5a. If I double the bass note, it gives it a kind of solidity. Compare that with that, the doubling in the bass. If I want something gentler, if I take, let's say, E, F, G, I'll double the note that doesn't make a rough dissonance. In other words, the rough dissonance is between E and F, the semitone dissonance, so I'll double the G. Makes it gentler. Same thing with F doubled, definitely harsher, because I'm doubling one of the notes of the semitone E and F. Okay, so that's just a simple guide to what you double, and that's a way, again, to sort of give a variety of texture. And all the kinds of harmony we've looked at in this course, we've always talked about the fact that you can't keep something exactly flat and the same all the way through a phrase. It's boring. There has to be some sense of up and down and breathing, and in this case is how we do it. As we can see, Doubling changes the character of the cluster.